What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. This is Shelf Appeal, the show where I go over the comic books that I picked up this week, give you an idea what they're all about, and let you know if there's something you should go back to the shop for or not. So to start off things, we're going to go with something that's been kind of I wouldn't necessarily say guilty pleasure as of recently, but definitely one that I've been enjoying for odd reasons. And that's Mighty Thor number 19. So the Mighty Thor, written by Jason Aaron with on and off art by Russell Dodderman, is a great tale of Jane Foster's Thor ever since she actually took up the mantle of Thor way back a few years ago. However, what we find is that this feels like it's very much running the course. Over the past couple issues, what we've seen her wrapping up this challenge of the gods against the gods of the Shi'ar Empire. And while the gods of the Shi'ar Empire are absolutely ruthless and holier than thou, pardon that kind of expression at this point in time, but it really kind of speaks to the humanity that underlies Jane Foster's character as Thor and how she draws upon that and the empathy of others. And she even calls upon the empathy of this storm in this particular issue as they battle the Phoenix, which is sent to basically decimate the entirety of this cosmic challenge. What we think is that this is the great punishment, the final task in this challenge of the gods. It's kind of odd, but overall, I feel like Jason Aaron's really wrapping up his entire take on the Thorverse. It feels that way. He's winding some things down. He's getting Jane Foster out of the Senate as a representation from Midgar, and it's really kind of interesting to see where this is going to go as far as the War of the Realms is concerned, which is going to be boiling up probably after next issue, because next issue, it looks like we're actually going to be getting a brand new Ultimate Thor, so that should be really interesting. After Mighty Thor, we're going to talk about God Country number 5. So God Country number 5 is the tale of a Alzheimer's riddled father that is trying to reconnect with his son after coming in possession of a great sword forged by the gods, or at least what he interprets as gods. This dying race, as we kind of learn at this point in time, this great being pulled a star out of the sky at the cost of billions of lives to forge himself this mighty blade. And the mighty blade has been cast aside, and it is now in the hands of this Texas farmer that he only really possesses himself, his true self, if he's holding on to the Valifax, the great sword that was forged. And what we see is that the great leader of this pantheon that is now a dying race of people that are held together simply by the magic of this particular old man, this power that he's emanating just to hold together what used to be his tiny universe, sends his son, War, essentially to fight and lay waste to the lands of Texas, destroy his entire kingdom in order to regain me that sword. And while the situation doesn't necessarily go how he would expect it to, it's pretty interesting to see exactly what kind of situation they get into. So the battle between the God of War as well as this Texas farmer doesn't really pan out the way that they would expect. And what we end up finding is that he possesses both these weapons. He's finally called back to sanity by the cries of his granddaughter, and he finds his way to the realm of these gods, which means that he's taking the fight to them instead of them taking the fight to him. He's going out there looking for vengeance and blood, and overall, I really appreciate everything that God Country is doing. It seems to be a bit of an acquired taste. The art style is very rough and gritty, which kind of resembles the story content. It's real and down to earth, yet fantastical at that same time, and I really kind of like it. It's one of those situations where you might want to check it out. However, you're probably better off just going back to the beginning and starting over if that's what you're thinking about. So next on the list, what we have is Wildstorm number 4, which is continuing the exposure of the Wildstorm universe to the DC lineup. And while I still feel like this is taking place somewhere in a parallel universe, not necessarily on the same Earth with the same New York City, because there was a small homage paid in Wildstorm number 1, it's still a book that I have no idea what is going on, but I enjoy it for some odd reason. So Wildstorm number 4, while it's not necessarily something that somebody's going to be able to grasp onto in quick measure, it's definitely something that I find interesting, and it's one of the few books that I've kind of kept on my pull list over a time of, let's call it purge and reconciliation. Which I'm going to get into detail in a completely different video. After Wildstorm number 4, we're going to talk about Ultimate Squared number 7, and with Ultimate Squared number 7, we see a tie-in to Secret Empire, because Carol and the rest of the heavy hitters from the Ultimates are currently cast out into space outside of this shield that was set up, well, by Carol herself. We see them kind of combating the situation, seeking out the help of the Lifebringer, and seeing if they can actually bring everything back together so that way they can take down the shield and make their way back to Earth. Unfortunately, not everything goes so well. This is probably my favorite kind of tie-in because it appears to be definitely one and done, and it relays emotional things. It still maintains a lot of key elements from the actual baseline story that is continuing on in Ultimate Squared, but it isn't necessarily derailing everything entirely. This is a situation that they would have had to run into. It goes through a logical course of action, and then ultimately, over a very short period of time, we see them reconcile themselves to fighting this particular battle, and it looks like they're actually going to be jumping off into a completely different direction without a Secret Empire tie-in for the next issue next month, which I really appreciate. This continues to be a kind of diamond in the rough book because it's really the only book in Marvel dealing with the cosmic universe on a much larger scale, which is always something that I find very interesting. The only thing that we run into is that I'm still kind of at odds with Travel Foreman's art, which is good because we have a reprieve this month with this particular issue as it's done by somebody else. However, it's not necessarily an improvement. The art of Christian Ward and the other guys that were kind of working on this, Kenneth Rocafort, they brought a very cool style to this, and I mean, I'm still just not seeing the same kind of style or the same kind of emotion, the same kind of evocativeness of the cosmic universe out of this book compared to the first run of Ultimates. So it's definitely something that I'm still going to be picking up. However, it's really tough to kind of recommend this book for anybody at this point in time. After Ultimate Squared, we're going to be talking about Batman number 23. So Batman number 23 is a one-shot, or at least it appears to be a one-shot, called The Brave and the Mold, which is a tie-in, well, not necessarily a tie-in, but it's kind of a team-up between Batman and Swamp Thing. And then by the time you get to the end of it, you realize it's not really a team-up at all. Which is kind of devastating. The reason it's devastating on a lot of levels is because essentially you see what is this helpless old man being gunned down in his apartment as the opening page. And this is not necessarily something that's uncommon for Tom King and Mitch Gerads. What they did in Sheriff of Babylon was a very visceral kind of exposure to the world of military contractors and military personnel overseas, and they brought this same kind of gritty style to the Batman book, which is definitely something different than what they did with the Catwoman tie-in, Catwoman team-up crossover kind of thing that happened a few issues ago before the button started up and before Bane came back. But what I did really appreciate is that the way that everything gets laid out, the way that everything is done artistically, it's one of those situations where you can get laugh out loud kind of moments, Swamp Thing asking why Batman has a car, and then, Batman asking why Swamp Thing needs a body. It's just like, these aren't necessarily necessities, but they make them feel comfortable. And I found that kind of humorous. I found the interactions between Batman and Swamp Thing to be pretty great, especially when you're talking about Swamp Thing's original interpretation of life. This is a photon that landed on something that turned into sugar, that went into my grandmother, and then became my grandfather or my father, those kind of things. And then to follow it up immediately with such a visceral sense of betrayal and, anger and those kind of things that left Batman not necessarily shaken, but ultimately, still questioning some of those things that he just found out from his father in this alternate parallel timeline kind of situation is a very intriguing sense. And I for a one-issue story, it was very compressed, but it was very well told. I really appreciated the way that this was done, and it's definitely something that I would recommend. If you're not on the Batman book, this is a totally fine one to get into, and it's something that you can enjoy on its own without necessarily having a lot of context. After Batman number 23, we're going to start talking about Superman 23. And Superman 23 is a continuation of the storyline Black Dawn, I believe. And this is a story that we find out is about a supervillain, vigilante kind of person that wasn't necessarily what I was expecting. However, this is really Hamilton County kind of going to pot. This is not necessarily a situation where Superman can handle particularly everything, and it's really about how John is being forced to grow up in this situation. There are some really gnarly, nasty scenes for a young boy to really witness of his parents that he's being forced to intake in order to kind of, I don't know, necessarily corrupt him or teach him a better path, to go beyond what his father was able to do, to be the man or the hero that people needed them to be, which meant crossing a line that Superman wasn't comfortable with. You could make all different kinds of cases as to whether this is a nature versus nurture kind of argument, but the real situation is that Cobb, who was always kind of prevalent, he was always present in the story, and there was always kind of this ominous nature that was, overarching idea that Cobb and Katie and those guys were really going to play a serious part in this whole story. And the fact that Peter J. Tomasi and the team really let this slow cook to this point is pretty awesome. I was expecting the turncoats aspects of these situations to really happen a lot sooner, and the fact that they let it keep into suspense is pretty great. I was hoping for something maybe just a touch more engaging in that respect. It seems at this point in time that maybe they were a bit puppetish, which really kind of creates it pulls back a dimension of Cobb's character and Katie's character that could have really been well done, if that's the case. So I'm still holding judgment on this one until the final issue to continue the storyline. However, Superman continues to be one of the best books coming out of DC Rebirth, and it's one that I highly recommend. And if we're talking about the consistency of greatness that comes out of Superman, we have to talk about Four Kids Walk Into a Bank number 4. So this is written by Matthew Rosenberg, and what we see is that this is the 4th issue, probably released in the last year. It has taken quite some time for this to get released, and I totally understand that. Matthew Rosenberg's had a lot of other projects. He was doing work on Kingpin. He's got the new Kingpin book. So from Civil War II until now, he's had a couple different vehicles for him to write for in terms of Marvel and larger publishers. The thing is, Four Kids Walk Into a Bank is what really got me into Matthew Rosenberg as a writer, and to see where it's kind of come, the characterizations are still pretty fantastic. I mean, the overall characters of the kids, Burger, Stretch, everybody that's involved in this, they have their own unique personalities and they're very well fleshed out. They're not necessarily caricatures, but you see things happen in the way that children would really present them, whether you're talking about extremely intelligent children or overly aggressive children or children that don't necessarily have a responsible father figure. And it's really interesting to see the realism portrayed inside this comic book in a very fantastical and farcical kind of sense. And it's, the kids themselves, it's just a very wacky kind of situation, but there's some underlying realism here that really kind of grabs you, and it makes you kind of gravitate towards this story. It's not necessarily something that I can't necessarily recommend it. I can say that it's definitely interesting to me, and it's one that you would have to check out for yourselves. The tough thing is finding all of the issues together simply because they've taken place over the last 10 months or so. So I would definitely check it out. It's one of my recommendations as far as Black Mask goes, which is a pretty small publishing house, but it's not necessarily for everybody, so your mileage may vary. So as we get down to the wire here, we're going to start talking about Secret Empire number 2. And Secret Empire number 2 deals with the aftermath of Las Vegas. So this is the attack that was perpetrated by Hydra on this city because it was the home of the Resistance, and they were kind of empowering those people to try and take on Hydra, and they were letting it happen. However, this was the decision that needed to be made, and what we find is that it causes kind of a fraction. It splits the differences between two different ideologies. You've got Tony Stark, who finally takes in the information from Rick Jones that he was holding off on as he was artificially drunk as his AI form, and then you have the faction of Black Widow, who's going to go a little bit more raw, a little bit more visceral, a little bit more take the fight to them in that respect. So instead of hunting down fragments of the Cosmic Cube, they're going to go and try to take off the head of this Hydra and see what's going to replace it. Maybe they can deal with that a little bit better. The thing is, they don't necessarily understand the entire power structure behind Hydra, which is a real odd parallel storyline, because we understand that Steve still holds on to those empathetic things that make him Steve Rogers. Even in his role as the Supreme Commander of Hydra, he still has those feelings. He still feels like he needs to be a defender of the people, not necessarily an attacker of the people. While he does rule through strength and order and those kind of things, it's more of a purpose to better humanity, not necessarily to instill fear. So he actually, we found out in this particular issue, kind of shifted that particular decision off to other people because he couldn't necessarily make that himself. And this is probably where we're going to see the slow unraveling of Steve Rogers as the head of Hydra, as all these villainous people who are true villains are going to start undermining him as they move forward. The interesting thing is going to be when Helmut Zemo turns on Steve Rogers. When is that going to happen? How is that going to take place? Are we going to see the resurrection of Bucky? How are all these other people going to interact? Because the way that Natasha is going, Black Widow is going to be an absolute assassin, and she's taking under her wing a lot of these young characters that are very idealistic and open-eyed, and they now realize what it takes to get it done, we'll get it done. We're not going to kill anybody, but we're going to do what it takes to get it done, while, Hawkeye and Iron Man and a few other people are going to be trying to find a way to fix Steve so that way he can help combat things on his own. So I really enjoy Secret Empire. There's a lot of layers that kind of go into this and I feel like a lot of these decisions are very much more earned in their sense. The Sorrentino's art is definitely a compliment to this particular issue, and it really helps out compared to, say, like the McNiven art last issue. It feels a little bit more out there, and it's just like it makes an uncomfortable situation feel like, okay, this could be something surreal and beyond what we'd expect in normal everyday life, and that's pretty excellent. Then to finish things off, we're going to talk about Flash number 22, which concludes the 4-part Button story between the Batman and the Flash. And okay, so it's a wind down. I'm not going to lie. There is an absolute confirmation that happens at the end of this book that I'm going to talk about in way more detail because I'm going to go through the entire Button storyline. But this is very much a wind down kind of issue. Everything's falling apart for the Flash and Batman. They're trying their best to get back to their own reality. And then we see this man show up out of nowhere. It's just like he calls his name and he shows up out of the time stream, out of the hyper time, and the Speed Force jettisons him forward. But he is not connected to Barry in the same way that Wally is connected to Barry, which causes him to kind of fade from existence or be banished. We don't necessarily know. And then we actually see the scene where Eobard Thawne meets God, or at least this personification of God that is happening in this. And we all know who this person is. And he looks on him with humble eyes and then is immediately destroyed as he reclaims his property. I'm going to call the Button his property at this point in time. And then we see there's an epilogue and there's a whole bunch of stuff. The Button is definitely what we needed as far as DC Rebirth is concerned on the anniversary, or pretty close to the anniversary of the release of the first DC Rebirth issue, DC Rebirth number 1. And it kind of gives us a really good sense of direction, especially if you take a look at what's going to be coming in November. And the question becomes, how does Big Blue take on Big Blue in the end? That's the real thing that I'm wondering what Jeff Johns is going to do with that. But it definitely has me excited for the fall lineup that's coming out of DC. So those are the comic books that I picked up this week, but I want to know what you guys grabbed too, so hit me up in the comments down below and we can start that conversation. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe right there and get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows, and games, and anything and everything having to do with comics. I promise I'm going to try and do this as often as I possibly can.